Jordan, I
Hello.
didn't see you there. Hi.
Yeah, I've been on all your Zoom calls without you knowing.
Wow, 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 wow. That's impressive. You know,
Me.
Jordan, I was walking around Delaware the other day,
Mm,
and it was a nice sunny day.
yeah.
I was walking down Sandusky, and I was walking past the Dairy Depot. And as I looked at the Dairy Depot, there was a family enjoying some ice cream,
Hmm.
and this small child was licking his ice cream, and he was really excited. And a strong breeze came, and it knocked the ice cream off of his cone and onto the floor, and he started crying.
Sad.
And I thought to myself, the enjoyment that he had with that ice cream, it was meaningless because he didn't know that it was about to all come crashing to the ground.
Mm, that's a bummer.
Yeah, dude. Welcome to Ecclesiastes.
Mm. Do. It sounds like we need like a sweet, like sick
Dude,
intro.
I literally was just thinking that would be the perfect part for the video to like fade and have like our intro video with like smoke pouring out everywhere. That would be, man, that was good.
We'll get
We're
there.
we're good at this. So yeah, we're talking about Ecclesiastes. This is our intro teaching time. And we're just jumping right into it. The book of Ecclesiastes is a piece of wisdom literature. Um, when you look at the books of the Bible, there's different types of books, right? There's some that are just like historical records, like when you look at Deuteronomy and Chronicles, they're kind of just telling these stories about what happened in Israel. There's letters when you look at pretty much all of Paul's writings. And you look at like First Peter and John and those, they're writing letters to people saying, hey, like Bill, I know you got these problems, let's deal with them. There's apocalyptic literature like Daniel or Revelation, and that's its own type of literature that's crazy and out there, and it's figurative, and we got all sorts of stuff going on. But smack dab in the middle of the Bible, you have a few books, three books that we would call wisdom literature. And the reason they're called that is that these books have a sense of the good life, right? That this world is crazy and there's all sorts of stuff going on, and that if you want to navigate this crazy world in a healthy way, in a way that will bring you life and goodness, that there's this thing called wisdom that will help us get there. And those three books are Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. All three of them have a different viewpoint on what that wisdom should be and how we achieve that good life. But in the midst of this global pandemic and times of questioning, we thought it would be really healthy to see what the Lord has for us in the book of Ecclesiastes. Jordan, do you have any opening thoughts on Ecclesiastes and kind of why we're here?
I've always liked the book of Ecclesiastes. I think someone wired like me and people wired like me have often said that it seems like a book that makes sense to them in terms of even what you described with the ice cream cone of why is the world set up this way? Why do these things happen? And often it seems like the viewpoint of the teacher or the person we're going to talk about as the teacher like makes more sense than maybe even some things we supposedly hear like in the New Testament, I think. And so I think I've spent a lot of my life trying to discern how those things work together.
Yeah. And like I'm right there with you. Like I remember as a little kid, did you ever have like the Ritz sandwiches that would have like peanut butter in them or things like that? Do you remember those snacks?
Yeah.
Well, they had these ones called s'mores. Did you ever have the s'mores?
No.
Dude, it sounds weird, but little mini Ritz crackers with like sugar filled s'mores frosting on the inside
That
was
sounds.
delicious.
Yeah, I'd do that.
And I remember this very specifically. As a little kid, my mom would be like, "Well, you already had one pack of those today. If you eat the other one, then you won't be able to enjoy them tomorrow." And I remember thinking to myself, well, like I'm going to get the same amount of enjoyment out of this pack of Ritz s'mores if I eat them today as if I ate them tomorrow.
Right.
And so like, I probably didn't think this thought as a kid, but like, then in a sense, isn't the pleasure meaningless? Like, I can have it now or I can have it later. Like, what's the difference of waiting for it? Like, why does it matter? Why not just enjoy it now?
I don't
Like,
know.
I was a young hedonist, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know why. I don't know.
But that's a question that I think the teacher would be like, yes, good job, young Brad. You're beginning to think about the world in a certain kind of way. But like, I feel like these are questions that all of us struggle with. Like, why does it matter if I mow my lawn today? It's going to be sunny all day and I can just mow it tomorrow. And instead I could do other things today. And you kind of struggle with this sense of like, what makes things really matter? And I think that's the big question that we're looking at is like in the book of Ecclesiastes is what makes things matter? And in order to get into that, we're going to spend the next few weeks talking about it. But to start, Ecclesiastes is a book that has two kind of voices going on. In chapter 1, verse 1, you see the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And so like, think about if you ever go to a conference and there's like someone who intros the speaker, right? They get up and they say, yeah, this is John Smith and he has this PhD and he's done this work. And usually they try to tell you something about like why the person is up there speaking to you on this subject. They'll usually tell you, oh yeah, he's an expert in this subject. He has this experience and all that. That's kind of what happens here in chapter 1, verse 1. But you realize somebody else is introducing the teacher. And so the first voice we hear, we're going to call the author of the book. This is the person who actually wrote the book, who collected the things that the teacher said. And then the second voice is that of the teacher. So in a sense, like when Luke wrote the book of Acts, he listened to Peter give a bunch of sermons, and then he wrote them down. And so in a similar sense, the author probably listened to this teacher, and he wrote down these sayings, and he wrote it all down, and he collected it for us.
Yeah.
So let's focus on the preacher for a second. The word in Hebrew is koheleth. And koheleth, it gets translated as preacher or sometimes teacher, depending on your translation. But it literally means collector. And I actually really, really like that term. I wish that they called him the collector in our English translation. Because when you look at the entire book, he just keeps saying over and over and over, like, I was walking around the kingdom and I noticed this thing. I noticed that the wealthy are never satisfied with their wealth. And I noticed that this person is always hungry and never satisfied. And I noticed that, man, the poor people die and the rich people die. And he's just kind of collecting all of these observations and all these realities. And he's just saying, these are interesting things. I've collected them. I want you to peruse them and think about them. One of the main things that he says, though, over and over, and if you've ever read Ecclesiastes, you'll see this word. He says it, I think, over 40 times in the book. But he says that things are meaningless. The King James Version translated it as vanity. And so a lot of English translations have followed that, and they call it vanity. The Hebrew word is Hevel, Hevel, Hevel. And it, vanity and meaningless, it kind of captures what the essence of the word means. But Jordan, I know that you and I and Stephen have talked a lot about this word. Can you give us some insight on what the word Hevel actually, its connotation?
Yeah. It's interesting when you brought up the vanity piece. I used to read the King James Bible, and it does very literally have kind of a different connotation, right? Like vanity kind of would proclaim to chase after these things means you are prideful,
Right.
instead of it just being a human intuition, because not everyone goes after glory, but everything in the book of Ecclesiastes applies to everyone, in my opinion. And so actually I think meaningless makes more sense, especially in this case, because Hevel is like I think the most literal translation is like a chasing after the wind, or like smoke, like something that is immaterial. You cannot grasp it, cannot grab it with your hands. To chase it, if you've ever been around a campfire, like trying to get even the smoke out of your face, right? Like you can't do anything about it. Like it's just going to do whatever it does and you have no control over it. It'll just, it's annoying and then it dissipates and then it's gone and you're stuck with what you got, which is nothing.
You smell like campfire.
And then you smell like campfire.
And yet there's something like, there is something real about smoke, right? Like
Right.
I can see it, and
Yeah.
like in general, I would say that, you know, I look at my computer monitor and I see this box and it has stuff on it, and I see Jordan's face in the screen, and I don't think to myself, well, I probably can't trust my eyes. Like I can see Jordan, but is he really real? Or is he just a smoke that if I try to grab for him, he's going to disappear? Like, no, like I trust what my eyes see. And so when I see a candle get put out and smoke starts rising, I don't think to myself, well, that smoke's probably not even real. It's probably just a figment of my imagination. Like it's real and it's there, but then I try to grab it or I try to wave it out of my face and it's not there. I can't feel anything. I can't stop myself from smelling like campfire. Like there's real effects of the smoke, but I can't grasp it. It's
Right.
and I think that's where like the term vanity comes in, is like when I think about a vanity, I think about an actual piece of furniture with a mirror where you do your makeup, right? And I think about like this idea of chasing after beauty. They talk about that in Proverbs a lot, that like beauty is fleeting, that, you know, you're beautiful when you're young and eventually your skin gets old and wrinkly. And I'm sure at the time that they wrote Proverbs, you were out in the sun a lot. So like it gets all leathery and eventually you're not beautiful anymore. And so like chasing after vanity is kind of that idea of like, man, you try to be beautiful and hold on to your youth, but eventually it's going to go away. So Hevel. So this is like the main thing that the teacher talks about, right? He talks about how everything is vanity. It makes me think, I'll just pull out a random example. In chapter 5, this is Jordan's favorite verse. Chapter 5, verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity, or Hevel. This also is meaningless. And as we look throughout this book, the entire book covers all sorts of topics. And if you looked at our fancy little graphic that Jordan made, it said, we're going to talk about wealth. We're going to talk about health. We're going to talk about all sorts of things under the sun. And that in the end, all of them, you know, are they meaningless? Do they have any value? Are they real? Can I grasp onto it? Or, you know, is it just kind of purposeless? Like, why am I chasing after these things? And I think this week, what I really want to talk about in a certain sense is, does anything have meaning?
Right.
You know, at the very start of the book, I think a good summary of the teacher's position in chapter 1, verses 12 through 18, he says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. And if you look at how they viewed the earth back then, they saw the heaven as this big dome, and that all of reality was encased underneath of it, all of physical reality. So when he says under heaven, he's talking about the entire earth. So all the things that humans do. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom, and to know madness, and to know folly. And I perceived that this is also a striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation or frustration, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Like, man, you read that, and Jordan, I don't know about you, man, but I'm just kind of like,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I can relate. There's a great book called The Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis, and I think it would perpetuate or talk about a way of life that feels similar to Ecclesiastes at times, because it even mimics in its voice or in some of the words that it uses that, like, chasing after knowledge and wisdom actually will bring you more sorrow. And I remember in the moment, as somebody who values knowledge and is something that I consider to be a gift, um, I have experienced where, like, more knowledge has brought me more sorrow. And in some ways, like, I've experienced at times ignorance is bliss. I would prefer that. But I've also, and we'll talk about this, but I was also pursuing that knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? For the fact of being someone who is considered knowledgeable, or for the fact of somebody who's considered wise. And that is, like, very fleeting and empty, because in my experience, there's always someone more knowledgeable, and there's always someone more wise, and there's always someone or something more X, or there's always one more piece of information out there. You know, if you've been to my apartment, I have a load of books, and a lot of those are a manifestation of, like, my desire to display competency. Of, like, if there's a problem I don't know the answer to, it's probably, the answer's probably here somewhere, but that actually doesn't get to the deeper root problem that I have, which is not having answers brings me great anxiety, right? And so, and I can't live in a world where I can't find an answer to something, right? Without Jesus, I would literally go mad.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, honestly, like, this conversation, it makes me think about our whenever we talk about the biblical narrative, we always end up talking about the fall, how God created us for a purpose to live within his definition of right and wrong. And we've chosen as a human race to define good and evil for ourselves. And because we continually do that, Ecclesiastes has happened, right? Because we continue to define good and evil for ourselves, humans just have this innate sense of wondering, what am I doing here? What's my purpose? Because I chase after money and it doesn't bring me satisfaction. You know, I remember I was kind of getting at this. I don't remember what I was teaching on specifically, but do you remember when I played the Tom Brady clip when he was on 60 Minutes and he just says, look, I've won 3 Super Bowls. You know, at the time he was like 26 or 7. He's like, I've won 3 Super Bowls. I'm at the top of my game, the top of my profession. I have it all. I have money. I have a wife. I have, you know, all this stuff. And yet I ask myself sometimes, is this it?
Right.
Like, is this, and like in that moment, the teacher is going, yes, Tom Brady gets it. Like, it isn't it. It's all meaningless.
Yep.
And I do want to give a cushion to that critique. You know, we encourage you guys to watch the Bible Project video on Ecclesiastes. And the big thing is that they call the teacher, the collector, the Koheleth, they call him like a middle-aged critic, that he just views the world around him and says, well, that's meaningless. And I see you chasing after money. That's meaningless. I see you chasing after pleasure. That's meaningless. I see you chasing after wisdom. That's meaningless. He just critiques everything around him. And that's why we need the author. We need him in this story because in chapter 12, at the very end, he's given the critic his time in the spotlight. And he says, you know, I think it's just fascinating because he gives him credit. You know, he says, besides being wise, the teacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. This is my favorite verse in the whole book. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote the words of truth. But I like that he says he sought. I don't think he found the words of delight, because if you read the book, they're not there. But he sought to find them, and he taught people. Then he says in verse 11 something really interesting. The words of the wise are like goads, and nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. And so a goad, Goad, a goad, it was literally like a stick that shepherds would hit the sheep with to get them moving, right? And sometimes they'd put like a little thumbtack on the end of it, because the sheep wouldn't really care if it got hit with a stick, but you poke it a little bit and it would get moving in the right direction. And we all know that a good shepherd, if you read Psalm 23, he's going to look for a place to lie down by peaceful waters. He's going to find you good grazing grounds. But we, like stubborn sheep, often won't listen to what God's asking us to do, even though he's asking us to do things that are good for us. And so sometimes you got to fix a little nail to that thing and just pop the sheep in the butt and get them moving, right? And it's interesting because that's what the author is saying this critic is offering us, that even though he has this negative outlook on life, and that when he looks at things under the sun, he says, well, it's all meaningless. It's all Hevel. That when we think about the world in that way, it can be a goad to push us into God's definitions of right and wrong. It can be a goad that pushes us into God's good life that he has for us.
Yeah.
Is that something that strikes with you, Jordan, or frustrates you?
No, I think for me it makes sense. I could say through my lens, I often see the world as a puzzle that I'm trying to figure out how it all fits together. And not everyone views it that way. But the helpful things for me have been to figure out how the world works. And that actually, the more I learn, the more I see that creation really does line up with the way that God intended it to be. And that actually our souls as human beings, our humanity, our peopleness thrives under God's care and protection. And I'm reading these really great books right now by a guy named James Bryan Smith, Good and Beautiful Life, Good and Beautiful God. And he asked this great question that I've been kind of ruminating on the last couple of weeks. He's like, in the 18th and 19th century, Dietrich Bonhoeffer asked, what is the cost of discipleship? And he said, I think in the postmodern world, we have to ask, what is the cost of not discipleship, of not being discipled? And I think that the cost of not choosing to take on the easy yoke, of not choosing to walk with Jesus and continue to discover what he has for us, is the ecclesiastical way of viewing the world. I think it is continued meaninglessness. I think it is continued disappointment. I think it is continued Hevel. And I think that because only Jesus can pursue these things in a way that has meaning, only disciples filled with the Holy Spirit can learn how to be content in this world and even thrive in a broken world. I think that's the only way that we can do it. And I think that is the cost of not being discipled, is to continue to put your hopes in things that are hopeless and to continue to see everything as smoke. I'm certain of it.
Yeah. And honestly, that makes me think about really the book of Ecclesiastes is kind of saying, if you looked at the world without there being a God, how many times have you heard somebody say or talk about atheists and well, if you're an atheist, what's the point of doing anything? You're just going to be born from dirt and go back to dirt. You're going to die and be in a box and everybody's going to forget you and nobody's going to remember your name. And we might think that we're really smart for coming up with that argument, but that argument was being made by the collector, the teacher, thousands of years ago. He was saying when you look at this world, this is a key thing to pay attention to in Ecclesiastes. He keeps using the phrase under the sun, under the sun, under the sun. When I looked at all things under the sun, I realized it was all vanity, meaningless, Hevel. Mm-hmm. And I think that what he's getting at is this idea of purpose, that God created all things for a purpose. You know, Jordan, I was telling you this metaphor earlier, but, you know, it'd be kind of like if I had a child that was like 3 years old and I gave him a telescope and I said, man, this telescope's really cool and you're going to be able to see beautiful, amazing, just spectacular things with it. And he said, thanks, Dad. And he took it and he beamed his brother over the head with it. Right. And he just used it to just club, you know, do that. Or he uses it. I don't know. Think of all the ways you could misuse a telescope.
Right.
And like, I feel like eventually he'd be like, well, this telescope, like, what's the point? Like, I can use it to club my brother, but I could also use this stick I found on the ground. And like, I didn't need my dad to give me this to beat my brother with it. I could beat my brother up with anything. And so like he might come to that ecclesiastical view of like, well, the telescope is meaningless and it's a vapor because it doesn't serve any ultimate purpose. He's like, well, no, the telescope has a purpose. You're just not using it right. You're not viewing it right. And so when you start to view things from above the sun, from God's point of view, you start to realize, man, like maybe money does have a purpose. Maybe being healthy does have a purpose. Maybe these things that we're going to talk about do have a purpose, but we're not going to find their purpose if we limit our viewpoint to a human point of view.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're going to be talking about over the next 5-6 weeks. For now, we're just gonna really kind of get into the glut of just meaninglessness. For discussion this week, we're just going to talk about where are areas in your life that you've recognized or noticed, man, what's the point? Why am I chasing after this thing? A big example right now that I think a lot of people are becoming aware of, a lot of people have already been aware of their whole life, is this idea of American justice, right? That we have a justice system where you are innocent until proven guilty, right? Well, you hear that, and then you look at what's happening to people of color across the nation, and you go, man, this isn't lining up. And so you might start to say, well, then it's meaningless. It's vapor. It's a smoke. I try to chase after justice and I grab at it and it disappears. It dissipates. And I smell like campfire afterwards, but it's not real. And so you might be tempted to say, well, then all justice is meaningless. I just need to look out for myself and my family. And, this whole idea of justice is meaningless. And I think when you look at scripture, I think that God very clearly values justice, that he judges Israel based on justice. Jordan, this is something that you continually talk about, that Israel's leaders are judged by how well they take care of the foreigner, the poor, the widow, and what's the fourth one?
The orphan.
The orphan. So like God clearly values justice, but then you look at justice in this world and you go,
yeah, it's not impressive. And I think people have an innate sense of fairness and justice that comes from God, but when it's not tempered by scripture or his will or a relationship with him, I do think it becomes something else. And I think we've seen that evolution over the long term with a lot of, not just America, with a lot of countries, a lot of people. Nobody has done justice correctly or perfectly, but there is a vision for justice that is personal, that is meaningful, and that is submitted to the Lord. But it's hard, and it's a hard thing to talk about even now in our climate, I think.
yeah.
But it is up to us to speak truth to that power, to our power, to the powers that be. We have to speak truth about what justice is to people that matter and who are making those decisions.
Yeah. I mean, a huge part of bringing the light of Christ's kingdom into this dark world is calling out people in positions of power and saying, this is wrong, this is evil,
Yep.
and it needs to be fixed.
Yep.
So this week, the only discussion question that I want you to think about and kind of start working through is what are the things in your life that you chase after, and you're kind of being made aware, like, man, this feels meaningless. I want to talk about those things. I want to discuss those things because it's important. When you look at this, it might become easy to say, well, it's all meaningless, so I'm just going to do whatever I want, and I'm just going to chase after things, and if I die, I die, whatever. But I think that there is purpose and meaning, and that Christ's presence in our life alone signifies that we're built for something more.
Yeah.
So let's wrestle with it. Let's work through it. It's not easy. I mean, these things that are meaningless can hurt us. Our lack of money can hurt us emotionally and physically. Racial injustice can hurt us. It's not good for anyone. And so I want to talk about these things that we're calling meaningless. We're calling them a vanity, a hevel, a smoke. But they are important, and we need to talk about them. So let's do it this week. Jordan, do you have any final thoughts?
I think what I'm just ruminating on, even as you reflect on that discussion question, I will say what Brad said is true. I think it's the revolution of a soul, like as it moves through, as it finds something that is meaningless. It knows that can't be the case, that must not be the case, but instead of really going into that crisis mode, I think most Americans move into like some form of hedonism of like, okay, I'm going to distract myself with every pleasure imaginable so I don't have to think about it. I think America is largely built on that to avoid those crises. And so even think about your friends or your family members who you've seen go through those revolutions and might even be going through that now. And I think that those are cries for help. I've found that most people who are asking questions like that or who are stuck in those patterns of just insatiable appetites that continue to have less and less of a returning, like a diminishing effect. They just do. They are asking questions about that. And so we have the opportunity to point them in the direction of a God who gives everything meaning.
Yeah, we really do. Well, Delco, we're excited to be with you this Sunday. I'm super thankful for Jordan and the wisdom that he brings. And I'm really excited to hear your guys' wisdom and to hear what you guys have to bring to the table. So we love you guys, and we'll catch you on Sunday.
See ya.